Hey guys, what's up? It's SelfDev. Welcome back to another video. So in this video, I wanted to talk about the issue of should we always let the majority vote allow the change of whatever it is that we are wanting to change. So if the majority vote for, say for example, a no-fly zone in Ukraine, then should we implement it? Or is there another way we should look at it? So from my understanding, in this example, a no-fly zone could very well trigger events which will lead to a world war, which is something that I don't think the majority of people will want. So what's going on here? Well, I think that we should absolutely consider what the majority of people want, but it's a really tough decision to make, because you can't really have a power that is directly connected to majorities. So at the end of the day, there is one person who will essentially make all the decisions, but there are things like laws and contracts and treaties that make them not able to do some things but able to do other things, and it's really up to them to do what they want in a lot of things. So that's why we have like presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens. So like, for example, even though the majority of people seem to want a no-fly zone, there's still not one happening. So in this example, I understand that it will probably or quite likely bring about the world war, which the majority of people won't want, I imagine, at least. And it's a good thing that there's no automatic trigger of the no-fly zone just because most people want it. So, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think that it will cause a world war if we had one. So I'm pretty glad that simply the fact that most people want a no-fly zone will not trigger that happening. So I think the main reason why most people want a no-fly zone is because they don't really understand the full implications and risk that will come with implementing such a move, and if they did, they probably wouldn't vote for it. So when it comes to thinking about what the majority wants, you also need to consider how knowledgeable are they about what they're voting for, what they're deciding, what they want. Like, are they really considering enough factors? And even though the majority want it, they don't know enough about let's say the history of war, what exactly a no-fly zone is. Like, they might not even know that. They might just hear on the TV a 5-minute explanation of what it might be, but they don't know exactly what happens if this happens, what happens if that happens. They don't know maybe enough history of Russia and Putin, like what is his drive. And I mean, even people who aren't supporting a no-fly zone, they don't know that a no-fly zone will guarantee a world war or nuclear weapons or like anything. It's just it's really hard to try to get everyone to get along and to try and create peace, because fundamentally humans are kind of like selfish. All animals and all plants basically are selfish in some way, and that's because we want to survive. And the reason why we might at least seem selfless and caring is because, whether consciously or unconsciously, we've worked out that it's safe to be selfless to an extent. But when it comes to risking, like if you're leading your own country, then that will come before other countries. And that's not a criticism, but we can only have so much energy. The vast majority of us will only have so much compassion that we can kind of share. And in order to be a good leader, we have to protect our own tribe, our own group, our own country. We're not quite at a stage yet where we can expand that empathy to multiple groups, unless there's maybe logical or strategical reasons, or you're simply an empath. So if you're like, let's just say an unorganized empath, and you were leading a country and you were like, a no-fly zone could save millions of lives in Ukraine, let's implement that. And then what happens is you create a world war, or you at least trigger the events to create a world war. And now look at how many more lives you've lost because you weren't thinking strategically or logically. And if you're an empath, then imagine how that's going to feel for you. And you've let your country down. You've essentially, you could even risk the human race as a whole, pretty much. And it could be the biggest disaster of the whole human history, like way more bigger than World War I and II. So when it comes to the majority vote, I don't think it should be the only factor that should be listened to. You can't just say, well, most people want this, let's implement this. I do think the world is slowly growing towards what's best for everyone, but what's best for everyone is not always what everyone wants. And me as an individual, in my domestic life, I kind of think of, if someone wants something, I want to give them that as an ENFJ in MBTI. But I've learned to actually think, well, will supplying what they want, will this give them what they need? Because sometimes what you think you want is not actually what will make you happy or successful or whatever you really want. So I'm trying to use my introverted intuition to figure out what they really need, what will make them happy more long term, and what will give them a good life experience. So if I was to have children and my kids were like screaming for ice cream or something, I would think, yes, they want ice cream in the moment, but if I keep letting them have ice cream, then they might end up like losing their teeth or something, and that will have consequences over their older life. They might struggle to get a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They might end up with fillings in their mouths, and that will be painful, and that might also eventually, through events, affect their mental health. So I have to think, how do I provide them the best overall experience throughout life? Like, not just what they want, like what do they need? So what does the majority need, not what does it want? And a lot of the time when I see how these powers like NATO and the US and the UK, how they are dealing with things, is I do quite agree with what they are doing for the most part, but I'm not going to talk too politically. I'm just trying to talk from more of a psychological point of view, because I don't know extensively the history on these relations with these countries or the psychology of the world leaders. So just bear that in mind. So yeah, I think I pretty much wrapped my point up. What does the majority need rather than what do they want? What is best for most people? And of course, considering the selfishness of the powers, like each individual country. I mean, while Zelensky of Ukraine likes to criticize not implementing a no-fly zone, we are just trying to do what's best and avoid world wars, avoid dragging in other countries unnecessarily into this conflict. And while we aren't fully sanctioning Russia or implementing a no-fly zone, we are still doing a lot of things to provide Ukraine. We are providing them with military assistance. We are providing them with medical assistance, and we are bringing in refugees to our countries. So we are doing a lot of things, but we are also trying to keep our own groups, our own countries stable. But at the same time, we are somewhat self-sacrificing, because obviously we're sanctioning Russia, and the supplies we usually get from Russia are decreasing. So we are not being completely selfish or selfless, and that's essentially how we should be, not just as countries but also as people. We don't want to be too selfish that no one likes us, or that no one will want to help us with anything when we need it, because we're a social species and we can't survive on our own. If you want to know more about this, there's something called spiral dynamics, and it basically shows you how society develops over time. And basically, I think this conflict is kind of like an ego backlash in terms of countries. And Russia, I think how it looks to me is they're trying to, in a way, repeat of the Soviet Union. And they're kind of stuck in the past, and we're trying to move on to a more conscious a more conscious connection in the world, and Russia is like still lagging behind along with a few other countries. And when all this war stuff is all over, then we can keep on moving and growing, because it's like a graph. It's like it goes up and then it falls down a little bit, but then it goes up more than it did the previous time, and then it goes down a little bit again, and then it goes up again and then falls down. And that, I think, is basically what happens. So we will never like turn back completely to how catastrophic things were in the past. I will talk more about this in the future, because it's quite an interesting thing to talk about. And essentially it's not just the leaders that have the most power over how things change and how quickly things change or fall back to unconscious states and phases of the past. It's also the people, because they are voting for who goes in power. And what I've heard talk about is, for example, when Trump was elected, I think that was partially ego backlash for the rise in quality of the US when Obama was president. He introduced things that were somewhat revolutionary, and some portion of the US were a bit shaken by that. They weren't really used to that. They preferred things how they were before, and I think those people ended up supporting Trump, I think, because they were more comfortable with the ideas of like making America great again, like how they used to be. So it's really interesting to think about how society slowly evolves, but it's not just the leaders who are fully in power, because if the people you are leading, if the majority of the people you are leading don't agree with what you're doing, then you can't really lead them properly. You will have uprisings, and in the past that's been shown by like kings and queens and emperors. They were overthrown because they were too tyrannical, and obviously the leader or the government is massively outnumbered by the population they are leading. So I hope today that leaders and governments realize this, and I think they do. So they are careful not to piss off the civilian population too much, because otherwise things will all fall apart. And I guess you could show that by how lockdowns are approached. Like, they weren't, at least in the UK and probably the US and many European countries, they weren't too strict either way, because if they were, then a large chunk of the population would be against that, and there would be protests, although there already were protests. But that's pretty much inevitable considering the nature of lockdowns. There would be protests if there were very few lockdowns, or they were very lenient, and the protests would be about, why aren't you protecting people from COVID, from catching COVID? You're letting your people walk around spreading the virus or whatever, and you're letting people just collect more and more dead bodies due to COVID. So either way there would be protests. It's all about trying to get balance of what the majority wants, and if you can, try to get them what they need. And honestly, it needs a great level of intuition and knowing what people need, not just what people want, not just repeating the past, introducing new laws, trying to be flexible but trying to be logical at the same time, and things like spiral dynamics, so they kind of give me hope that the human population and society will just keep getting better and better and better, and we will be more connected. I mean, things like NATO, how many countries are in NATO? Quite a lot. Like, a good chunk of countries are in NATO, and a lot of them who aren't in NATO are still allies, just like unofficially for various reasons, just wanting to keep the peace, sort of neutrality. So we as a species are quite connected in the world, but there is still a long way to go. There are still a lot of laws that should be eradicated or modified, or have exceptions to, and there are still, as I said, a few countries that need to evolve a bit more. I'm not exactly sure how. It's really unpredictable right now with the Russia-Ukraine thing, but assuming Ukraine does win, which I really hope they can, then I hope Russia is somehow allowed to learn the error of its ways, and to not turn its loss into anger and fear, because they will just plot another horrible event in the future, maybe even start a world war. If not in this year, they might plan it like in the late 20s or 30s or something. So we shouldn't be too harsh on Russia to piss them off and start a third world war. And we should, I'm not sure how, but we should try and allow them to increase their consciousness in spiral dynamics. If I could figure out exactly how to do that, then I could make another video on that, on how to increase the consciousness of a country, without saying, or without trying to be too, I guess, peaceful, and just like not provide any consequences for Russia, because Russia needs to know that it's the 21st century and what you're doing is not okay, and Russia needs to keep up with the times of the rest of the world, but at the same time to be careful not to treat them like they are, I guess, naughty children, and to treat them like they can grow and they can survive, because what we're all doing is we're trying to survive, and pretty much everything we do is for survival. And from what I understand, Russia sees Ukraine joining NATO as a threat to their survival, because Russia might feel like they're being outnumbered by all these NATO countries, and Ukraine just adding on top of that, just pretty much Putin is scared of Russia's position in the world, and Russia is just, it's starting to get concerned about its survival. Now, I don't think NATO unprovoked is a threat to Russia, but that's not really important because it's all about perceived threats. And if you perceive something as a threat, then you will take some kind of action, whether or not it's logical or rational, and that's just how it is. Yeah, I think I've made quite a few points on a lot of things in this video, so I hope I've explained them right. If I haven't, then please let me know in the comments. If you wanted me to clarify anything, and as I said, I am not extensively knowledged in like world history and politics. I'm just trying to link things back to psychology. I hope you don't miss my point and kind of focus too much on opinions on politics or factual information about history and countries and people and relations and all of that. So thank you very much for watching. It's nearly half an hour long, but I hope you found some interesting insights and thought-provoking ideas. So thanks for liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, and watching nearly half an hour of my content. And I will see you in the next video. Hope you have an awesome day and an amazing life.